And how did it all start, and why did that happen? And how is it that human consciousness has become so dysfunctional? And if you look at human history and different centuries, you can see it looks as if it were becoming, in the 19th century, everybody believed in progress. It's getting better all the time, they said. They also believed that science had already almost solved all problems that we could possibly ask. And then the 20th century came. And then they realized how little they knew, and they realized how dysfunctional the collective human mind is, the destructiveness that was unleashed upon humanity by humans on other humans on a vast scale through the madness of political movements and ideologies and unbelievable suffering caused by humans to other humans. And so, if you look at that, and if that is not dysfunctional, what is? And this has been the worst century of all the 20th in terms of suffering and people killed. And this is a very young century we are in now, a very young millennium. And already, when you watch TV, it's a continuation of the 20th century. And if nothing changes in human consciousness, we'll have another 20th century, except it'll get worse, because science and technology continuously increase the effects of human madness, the tools created through intelligence. Yes, it requires great intelligence to manufacture these things. And very often intelligence in the service of madness. So there is that basic dysfunction in the human mind, and it is so deep, it's becoming so obvious now that very unlikely that the planet would even survive another 100 years of this same dysfunction. How could? It's become so destructive. Why is it? How did it all start? And is there a way beyond that? I am saying there is a way beyond. A new state of consciousness is already arising, but this must not be made into some new belief. It's seeing that a new state of consciousness is already arising within you, while the old state of consciousness, perhaps or probably, also is still operating within you. So the old state of consciousness, to call it, this is the dysfunctional state, is continuing. This is what you hear when you watch the news on television. It reports about human madness. But at the same time, the new is arising. We can only hope that it is arising in sufficiently large numbers of people and quickly enough before the old consciousness self-destructs. So we need also to look at the essence of the dysfunction, because if it is a dysfunction in the human mind, it must operate in each human being, and it should be possible to locate it in oneself, rather than saying the evil is all out there. It's not evil, it's simply a form of unconsciousness. And what is that unconsciousness? At some point in the evolution of humanity, there was the beginning of thought, an incredible evolutionary leap. The ability to conceptualize, to think, to formulate mental symbols arose. This is probably what the book of Genesis refers to when it speaks of the first humans who ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Suddenly the mind was able to differentiate this, good, bad. The knowledge of good and evil, the knowledge of good and bad. A few hundred years ago, Shakespeare wrote in one of his plays, "Nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." The arising of thought was an enormous thing. And we cannot say that it was bad. It happened because it had to happen. Whatever happens has to happen. There is nothing that happens that is not brought about by the totality. Everything is a web of interconnectedness. So whatever happens cannot be otherwise. This is what most humans don't know, because they are against what happens. This shouldn't be, but it is. Thought arose. And very quickly humans became the dominant species because of the enormous power of thought. And over a long period of time, thought began to operate more and more. And then gradually, the human sense of identity, of self, of who I am, became bound up with the movement of thought. An image developed in the mind of me. Humans began to have a relationship with themselves. Nothing on the planet before ever had a relationship with itself, nor to this day. The tree doesn't have a relationship with itself. The cat doesn't have a relationship with itself. It is itself. And since the cat doesn't have a relationship with itself, its life is, compared to human life, not without challenges, but unproblematic. It doesn't carry the heaviness of a problematic sense of self derived from continuous thought activity. And so a cat doesn't need therapy because it hasn't split itself into two, me and myself. Because now life is becoming very complex. So humans began to walk around with a self-image, a self-concept. It took a long time to develop. Whereas before life had been so unproblematic and easy, human life was one of many ways in which the totality expressed itself, as it still does in nature. And then one could call that the original innocence in humans. The original innocence that is still there in nature. This is why it's so beautiful to go into nature. It's why it's so beautiful to even watch an animal. Even if it kills another animal, it's still innocent. And so humans lost the original innocence that is there when you are yourself. And then a phantom self arose that walked with them wherever they went. And its main location is in the head, one could say. As a me. And so life became increasingly problematic because they lost that rootedness in being that a tree has, a flower has, an animal has. Without knowing it, it has it. Without knowing it, it knows itself to be one with the one. So it doesn't live in that neurotic state of continuous anxiety and tension. So an amazing event on this planet, this arising of self, a mind-made self. And so gradually that sense of being rooted in being one with the one life, I don't want to use words like God, they've been misused for too long, being rooted in being, one with that. And then gradually they lost that. They became disconnected, or still were connected but didn't know it anymore. So it's as if they were disconnected from life. So they became little entities that felt separate from the totality. They had taken themselves out of the web. And then they say, me. They say, I. And when they say I, they refer to a conceptualized sense of self in the head. They refer to their name, which is only a thought form, a thought, or a sequence of sounds. John Smith. I. Who are you? John Smith. That sounds convincing. But is nothing, means completely meaningless. It means nothing. So you have the illusion that already you know who you are. So, and then John Smith is going to tell you, if you ask further, well, who are you? Beyond that, he says, well, I am a father of two and an accountant and a graduate of that university, and he may have some longer story to tell. Divorced twice, and so he will give you a little story, which is the story of the self. And there are other aspects to that self which are not always on the surface. There are certain reactive patterns in the self. There are ways in which that self interprets the universe because it's been conditioned by its culture and its environment in certain ways. It is the content of the mind. It is the emotions that accompany those mind movements. So two together, the content, the conditioned content of the mind, because everybody gets conditioned by their surrounding culture, the world, personal level, collective world, the country you live in, the culture you live in, the time you live in. The language is itself a strong form of conditioning, your first language, the way it is spoken, what it contains. It's already a world view, one could say, is already embodied in the language. So at an early age, all that happens, and gradually as the child, after the child utters his or her name, when he or she is asked, what is your name? John Smith. Then that is easily now other things will cling to that first concept of self. Memories, experiences, knowledge, things that the sense of self gathers around itself to make itself more complete. And for the rest of his life, John Smith is going to look for things to absorb into his sense of self, to add to his sense of self, because his sense of self is not sufficient yet, has not completed itself yet. He doesn't feel that he is really fully himself yet. There is a sense, an underlying sense of lack, of not enough, of insufficiency, of I need some more, something more. This isn't it. And this is built into the very structure of this mind-made sense of self. It's discontent, lack, fear. It's always there somewhere. Because ultimately it is only a mental formation, a conceptualized me in the head. And as such, it can never feel complete. So it's condemned to seeking to add more to me in whatever form. Hence, the need, the enormous psychological need for future. Because it's through future that I can find the more that will complete me, that will make myself complete. And that's a deep-seated collective mind pattern associated with the self, the sense of self that is conceptualized. Of course, the moment you live in and through a conceptualized sense of self, this is the fate of all humans, they have to go through that. The moment that arises, your entire reality, the world with which you interact, becomes a conceptualized reality. In other words, you see it through the filter of the conditioning of the conceptualized me, the sense of self. So whatever you look upon, interact with, is immediately, according to its conditioning, the conditioned self, interpreted, judged, labeled, according to the conditioning. So that is what humans have in common. No matter what nation, what culture they belong to, or in the more advanced countries, the dysfunction is also more advanced, that's all. But they all have the same dysfunction. The way in which things are being labeled varies enormously. If you were from a different culture, Arabic culture, and you walked around Stockholm, you would label things in a different way. The things that you call good and bad would be different. And when you go there, what you call good and bad there will be different from what the locals call good and bad. Very different. But of course, each person is so identified with the mind-made self and its mental positions and labels, it's almost impossible to step out of identification. Identification means deriving your sense of self from the mental positions and see that other mental positions are just different mental positions. To see that one's own conditioning and mental position is no more than that and does not contain the truth. It is an aspect, at best, an aspect of the truth, an aspect of the totality. In other words, all thought, all mental positions are fragments, fragmentary, relatively true perhaps. They cannot contain the totality. So humans don't know this. There's total identification with mind movement, with a mind-created self. And so, then there are the others, which have their form of conditioning, are totally identified with that. And they need each other to enhance their always insufficient sense of self. So this is why humans love to have enemies and make enemies, especially groups, but or even individuals do it, unconsciously of course. The groups that have their group identity, which is a conceptualized story which they're telling themselves, including patterns of reaction and behavior and thinking, these groups have a strong need to have other groups that are their enemies, because through fighting and being in opposition to others, they strengthen their illusory sense of self. So the boundary around me, the more enemies I have, the stronger this boundary, which is mind created around me, becomes. And the stronger the sense of separateness, which is the boundary, the stronger the illusion of self, of me. Whether that self is a predominantly personal sense of self, or whether that self is a predominantly collective sense of self, which is our tribe, our religion, our nation, our group, doesn't matter. It's the same principle is at work. It is a conceptualized identity. And the conceptualized identity is looking for problems and conflict because it needs that so that this mental structure can define itself. Me, not me. Me ends here, and there's the rest of the world. And some of the rest of the world I can actually use to make me a little bit bigger. So I'm reaching out to looking for things, new things to add to the content of my mind, to identify with, to make the self more complete. So everybody's looking out for self-completion, to add more to me, because I end here. And then other things in the world, the not me world, are threatening, because there are many things out in this world that might take away things from me. So the world is also a dangerous place and a promising place at the same time. I fear the world and I want amazing state of consciousness. So, whether on the collective or the personal, there's this great need to complete me through adding more content, mental, because even if you want to acquire more possessions in order to feel a little bit more secure in who you are, in order to feel a little bit bigger, because you have a big car and a big house, and so your sense of self can expand into the car. Not really the car, but the thought form of car. The car itself is quite meaningless because it's metal, and in a few years it'll be reduced to rust. So it's not the car, but it is the thought form of car, if it's a big one. The thought form of car that the self, you identify with the thought form. So that is then added to the collection of thought forms that is me, and for a little while the me feels just grown. I'm getting somewhere because I've added that to me. And then it won't be long before the thought form no longer really fulfills its purpose of completing me, and again, it's not quite enough, this car. And then comes maybe the house. And again, for a while it feels the house, it's not the house, it's not the fact that you own the house. The whole idea of ownership is a fiction. It's to do with a fictitious sense of self. What does it mean, I own this? You're telling yourself a story in your head about this house, and that story says, it is me. I own this house. It is mine. It means nothing. If you were insane and you said, I own half the city of Stockholm, and if you were insane, you could go around to the city telling this to people and say, okay, you better go for treatment. You're insane because nobody agrees with you. If you say, I own this huge building and nobody agrees with you, then you're insane. If you say, I own this building and everybody else agrees with you and they sign a paper to confirm that they agree with you, then you own it. In either case, it's a story. The only difference is, it's a story that nobody agrees with, in which case you're insane, or it's a story with which everybody agrees, then you're wealthy. But it's a story. It's part of this, so ownership is part of the story of me. And of course, it loves that. It loves to own. And then that's, of course, you can, no matter how much you add on that level of thought forms, the thought form of ownership, it won't ever really be enough. So then you have to go on to other things to add more to complete me, other people's opinion of me. This is a little bit less tangible than heavy material things. So that becomes an important thought form if other people think that you are great, you are very important. And then the conceptualized self is always looking out to get that recognition. Oh, please, thank you. you're so great. Ah, yeah. Or it might say, oh no, I'm not really great, but it thinks, oh, it feels so good. And then perhaps the entire, you might even, some people amass great wealth on that level, the wealth of thought forms, that you are very important. You might become important in the eyes of the world. And so that then the self certainly feels expanded. They might even build, they don't do that so much anymore these days, a big monument of me before you die. And then that thought was, surely I must have made it now. But no. You wake up in the middle of the night with a state of fear, and it's not it. And you might even at that point look through the delusion and see what the world is built up around you is a fiction. What the newspapers are saying about you and the glossy pictures about you, in case you are, let's say, a famous actor or actress. And then you suddenly see this is just a big, all is like there's nothing real here. They're talking about some illusory entity. They've created this illusory entity which has nothing to do with me. And so at that point, perhaps you step beyond, when so much has been added to you and you haven't arrived at that sense of having made it. And then at that point you might begin to go beyond that. And this is usually the point where the spiritual life begins for people. It's the realization that I cannot complete me on that level. I've tried. And okay, so everybody in a way has tried and failed on that level before the spiritual dimension opens up, or before the spiritual search begins. You must have failed somehow. Of course, everybody fails, except they delude themselves that it can still work out. On the level of story, on the level of the conceptualized self, it cannot work out because it is in the very structure of that mind-made sense of self that it lives predominantly in a state of discontent and not enough, and conflict and problems. It is part of the structure, not the content. The form that this takes, discontent, not enough, problems, conflict, varies from person to person, from culture to culture. So that's the content. But it is not, the causal factor is the structure of a mind-made self, which is condemned to continuous, to not making it. And only in movies do they make it. In novels, but even novels, only in the bad ones. The bad ones have a happy ending. And they lived happily ever after. That doesn't happen. Because the stories after the wedding continues. After the honeymoon, it goes on. And then the person who was meant to complete you, make you happy, fulfill me, complete me for the rest of my life, fails to live up to that expectation. He or she isn't doing it. You're supposed to completely make me complete, happy, fulfill. In many ads you read, looking for a man or woman to make me happy. Who could live up to that? So really, you're looking to the world to complete you, which is really the world then becomes translated into thought forms. But it cannot do that. So that's an amazing realization. And the moment you realize that, the spiritual life opens up